Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. What if the thing that sets the best technology leaders apart isn't how well they build, but how deeply they understand the business underlying what they're building? Right now, boards of mid-sized companies all over the place are running AI pilots that show little to no return, and revenues being reported as booked long before it is ever realized. The gap between the story a business tells about itself and what is really happening underneath has rarely been wider or more expensive. My guest today has worked through more than 50 M&A transactions, and he has built a career out of finding what is hidden in that gap. He has a way of seeing companies the most technology leaders never learn. And by the end, I hope you might start seeing your own company differently too. I'm your host, Adam Horner, CTO coach and founder of the CTO Playbook. You can find out more about coaching, cohort courses, and more resources at thectoplaybook.com. Now, let's meet Jaco and learn about his M&A playbook. Jaco, welcome to the CTO Playbook. I've been looking forward to this one. You describe yourself as a CTO who doesn't want to talk about technology, and I think we're going to, that'll make sense a little bit more to the listeners by the time we get to the end of this one. But to most of my listeners who are coming from sort of engineering at startups and scale-ups, the work you do is somewhere that quite a lot of them haven't yet been. So I'd really love it if you could just introduce yourself by telling us a bit about what it is that you do and the value that you bring to organizations you work with.
Thanks a lot, Adam. Great to be here. I think the biggest thing that I bring in is coming from a very business perspective. So whilst my titles might say CTO, CIO, having led startups, everything comes from a business background. And therefore, when you say, I don't want to talk about tech, is the tech should really be not an afterthought, but follow what you want to achieve with the business.
Yeah.
Rather than it being tech for tech's sake, or what we find now is AI is the answer. What's the question?
Seeing that more and more at the moment.
Yes. And that's a theme that I find throughout, be it transformation, product development, M&A, focus on what you want to achieve before you find the tools to do so.
And who are the kind of organizations that you would typically be working with, trying to make a difference to?
Quite a range. The majority that I focus on is mid-market, traditional business, we can call them that. And traditional is manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, B2B services. I do work with startups, technology companies, some financial services as well. But my focus is on really the mid-market, where there's traditionally being led by either the founder owners or a few stages of private equity. But the management focus on the business and don't necessarily have appropriate technology leadership, even if they've got software or data products that's part of their portfolio, they very rarely have real technology leadership. They will have engineering and product leads, but not necessarily somebody that looks out across the business and see how it all needs to fit in to deliver the outcome, and more so on a transaction basis. It is building towards a certain valuation, and therefore everything needs to line up. And there's that gap where product happens, business management happens, but not necessarily being gelled.
Right. Okay. So often the sort of the leaders you're working with, at least the technical and science leaders, are often, they're scientists, they're pure engineers. They're not the kind of the full package CTO who's translating and delivering across that piece at the top of the business.
They're usually focused on their domain rather than the entire business.
So domain experts is quite a good way of explaining it then. Excellent. Okay, cool. And so, I mean, you mentioned there that you've changed your title down the years, CIO, CDO, CTO, CAIO, I think in some cases as well.
Yes.
I mean, so what is it about the title, if anything, that matters to you, or is it purely about what the intent and impact is in terms of working with the business?
I think the title carries a little bit of gravitas and the positioning, more so now than what it used to be. It used to be very much CIO, and if there's somebody for CTO title, they were just pushed into the corner of, you look after product engineering. And that could be, if we look at manufacturing organizations, you're the expert on manufacturing that product. And the same when it gets to software or services, it's the expert there. And it's more and more shifted away from what had a CIO sat on a board and it's about the enterprise technology and all the information, more towards a CTIO, and in between we had the chief digital officer title mixed in when digital transformation was all the rage. And now we're getting chief AI or chief technology and AI officer, or whatever mix there is.
Yeah.
The thing that I find, though, is most organizations don't really have a consistent way of referring to it. They, in general, expect, apart from if it's purely focused on the product technical lead or technical executive, but in general, a CIO, CTO, CDO, CAIO, all those flavors mean the same thing to most businesses. A technology leader that considers and works with the business and the executives and translates it into what is the appropriate technology that they need, making the right investment, and leading them into a future where it's creating stability, growth, and factoring all the new things that might come in, not necessarily just dropping it in because it looks shiny, but making sure that the technology is appropriate for the business. And then having the leadership around that with the various teams coming in to support. So the title is, or the titles is all over the place. It's the intent and what it needs to achieve that's important.
And from that, I think one of the things that I've sort of picked up from your work then is very often you'll be working with somebody in the business already, but they are, whatever title they have, it could be CTO, it could be something else, they're often sort of reporting to the leadership team, the board, the executive management team, rather than being what I would think of as being a full-fledged member of that, leading the business as well as leading the tech and the science.
That's very often the case, and even probably a few rungs further removed than just reporting directly into the board. So you might have, and traditionally, there's been IT that reported into the CFO or somebody else, because IT was somewhere in the corner. Don't speak to them. They just need to make sure things work. And it really devalued what role it actually plays, especially in modern businesses. It is a key enabler, not just for operating the business, but driving efficiencies, improving revenue. The technology is what enables it. And when we look at M&A transactions, historically, technology was also an afterthought unless it was procure or buying a software company. But more now, I've been involved in over 50 transactions, that it's becoming far more important knowing what the technology is, but once again, related back to the operation. So what data do we have? Do we have the right data? Is it actually our data? Do we have the systems to operate, or are we doing it all on paper and Excel? Is there proper automation or workflow? Because it can either indicate an opportunity for operational efficiencies into the future, or potential constraints that may not make this a good investment. So technology and the enhanced space behind it, data, digital intellectual property, especially within AI, cybersecurity, all those things becoming so much more important in the M&A transaction because it influences how you need to value the company, and then what it might look like post-transaction. Can you integrate this business? Does it need to invest? Do you need to remediate a lot? Is your operations actually quite flawed because your data says one thing and you're reporting something else within the management accounts? So it becomes very important how that translates into what the business actually looks like now and what it could be in the future.
Excellent. And I'm sure we'll get into the transaction itself. And of course, some of those things that come after the transaction, which are often not thought about. Integration, you just mentioned a couple of others as well.
The success of a transaction is not made once you sign and close. It is in the 6, 12, 24 months post-transaction.
Yeah, exactly. But what I wanted to do first, Jaco, is just sort of scoot back a little bit in time. And because one of the things I find is a lot of CTOs come from a development, engineering or science background. But I just wanted to quickly ask, I mean, you profess to come from very much a business side of it, but where did you start? Where was your first step into this M&A world of technology companies?
So very much a different path. I originally studied medicine. I didn't qualify as a medical doctor. I left that to my sister.
Wow, okay.
I went on to get a marketing degree. I did get a qualification in sports rehab therapy, never used it. But I got a marketing degree and started working in the business, not just on marketing side, but very much customer, product management, distribution. And in that process, in my early 20s, I encountered a large production or manufacturing and distribution organization, sub-Saharan Africa. Of course,
Right.
you can detect I'm South African, living in the UK. And they approached me to implement CRM across the organization, multi-billion turnover. And eager 21-year-old, having a reasonable sense of business, did some consulting with a department store group. And I went in, and literally on the first day, they gave me a box with CDs inside and say, implement this. So it's very easy to go and put this into a computer, switch on, load, software is installed. But we need to make sure that, are we connecting everybody up rather than to just run on their local laptops? How does it fit in with finance and the whole fulfillment process, stock control, distribution management, retail EPOS? And the answer was, we don't have any of that. Everything is done manually. In branches, they've got their own EPOS, prints out everything on a monthly basis, ship reams of paper into head office. Same from factories, the warehouses. Everything gets collated on a monthly basis on paper. Somebody puts it into Excel. Oh, and by the way, we don't have a finance system. This is a company turning over $2 billion of revenue.
Wow. And that was still all on paper. What year was this?
2001.
Wow. I mean, how many businesses are there out there like that still running on
You'd
paper?
be surprised.
Yeah.
I think it's less now. Now it's all in Excel and Word and fragmented documents. No, not necessarily always the case, but there are companies where it is lots on paper. And I encountered one earlier this year where they were still running the entire warehouse and stock control, their distribution management, all on paper, and then retrospectively, somebody recording it in Excel and then uploading the Excel into one system, but they don't use it as a system of record. So that still exists. That company didn't turn over 2 billion, the recent example. That only had a 50 million turnover.
But that's still not an insignificant business at that side to be running effectively on paper and pencil.
And not an insignificant business, no. So, and that's where I encountered, look, you can't implement this because your sales is going to be so disconnected from everything else. And surprise, surprise, it turned out to be so. What I took upon myself was to implement systems across the business so that everything can be joined up. And that's how I found myself absolutely loving understanding the detail of the business and how that translates into the right systems for making the business work, not the most grandiose or the most fanciful or latest technologies, but what makes the business work at the right investment. And I started implementing all of that. And within 3 years that I worked within the company, we implemented AI services for distribution, for product demand control, distribution management, customer fleet. It was a commercial transport support service and manufacturer, actually from paper to AI in the early 2000s within 3 years. But just looking at the business first and what it needs to achieve, what it wants to achieve, how it operates, and then putting the systems, processes, data, and automation in place that makes it work. And that's where I started. In that 3-year journey, I ran 3 M&A transactions, acquiring new regional areas and competitors. And I just found this is what I love doing. How technology enables the business in the right way, objectively, and then implementing it in a sensible manner without crippling the business. Because a lot of times when technology gets implemented or change gets done, it neglects to think, how do we maintain this business stability? And in an M&A context or investment context, how do we preserve value? You might have ambitions of creating value, which is what most transformation or new solutions are about.
Yeah.
Driving efficiencies, new products, new revenue streams. But if you don't have stability, you're just going to be layering things on top of something that's already crumbling or doesn't even exist.
And I think that sort of your image of you sort of taking that stack of CDs and saying, what's the point of this without the processes and systems behind it is quite a visual metaphor for the kind of work you seem to have been doing for quite a number of years since then.
And that's been a 25-year plus journey of applying. What does the business want to achieve? How does it work? What technology do we need? And oh, by the way, we're now acquiring businesses. How do we need to look at them as well? And how do we bring them on board?
I mean, so you talk about companies, leaping at the opportunities that are available, but making misplaced investments. I think is probably the best euphemistic way of putting it. Wasting money. Let's call it what it is. I wanted to look into that because I think a lot of CTOs, CIOs will recognize this pattern in their own organizations where there's a new idea, a new concept. The CEO goes off to a conference and comes back with a great new idea, throws it at the.
I want one of those.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that comes quite often. I mean, you said that companies don't actually know what they have and don't know what they need. And yet when they throw one of these things in, you must have some brilliant war stories about how that's gone horribly south very quickly then.
I think the horribly south is usually, which we see quite often, is just not realizing any return on the investment. And we see it a lot with AI at the moment. In the news, it is everybody's running pilots, but nobody's seeing returns.
Just a load of sunk cost.
Yeah, that's in part because they're rushing. Firstly, AI is not new, but for a lot of people, it seems new because it's just more prominent in the media. And therefore, they feel, oh, we're going to be left behind. But the capability is just an evolution of what we've had 20 odd years ago. Yes, processing is better. We've got better connectivity. We've got next to infinite storage. So we have all the things to make things better. It is not leaps and bounds. The models have improved, yes, and therefore it's, especially in the transformer models for large language models, that is what most people associate with AI, but there's a raft of other things. But when we get to, we want to implement AI agents and we want to automate, that is what most people see. And they go to a conference and somebody does a very nicely contained demonstration. And it's like, it can do magic. And that's the problem. They see it can do magic and sometimes translate it into, how much cost can I take out of the company? People, unfortunately. I go the other direction and say, let's not look at, if I take this, sprinkle the magic dust, just look at what magic it can do. Let's go back to, what do you actually want to achieve? Because every time you bring something new in, you change direction. You're going to drag things away from where you actually want to be going. So my first challenge with most businesses is, what do you want to achieve? Do you know that? And then we get it back to, so what are we dealing with now? Because you need to bring everything into context. Objectively, and AI is a prime example, where most companies don't have the data. They don't even have their processes defined. So now you want to introduce a technology that should automate on a probabilistic basis a process and a way of working without you having the logic, the rules, the data, the process, all the wider context that it needs to operate within in place. In M&A, that is becoming a far greater importance as well. With AI all over the place, it comes under significantly higher scrutiny to be able to demonstrate the veracity of the models, the auditability, the traceability, the controls, the governance that you've got around AI, and then of course the cost controls, because we can see that spike quickly when everybody starts burning tokens and they haven't really thought of the costs. And we had the same scenario back when cloud started to become very prominent and people were building everything on cloud native environments. And they weren't aware that the costs are going to increase significantly as they had higher consumption. So everything around technology is not just about what the tech itself can do, but how does it fit in commercially and operationally?
Yeah, it's one of those things I often say that history doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. And this idea of burning money on something that looks like magic comes up time and again. And I often go back to, was it Asimov's first law, where he says, anything that looks like magic, any sufficiently advanced technology looks like magic. And the key for me in that bit is a sufficiently advanced.
Sufficiently.
Because if you haven't got, if you've got something that looks like magic, that means you're not actually ready for it. If you're not ready for it, then you probably don't have the basic building blocks in place. And as you said, there's things like processes, approaches, data cleanliness, validity, and all the rest of it, which if you had all those things in place, then it would no longer feel like magic because those are the building blocks for it. And then it looks like something you can reason about.
It becomes an increment.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you say Asimov, I usually refer to the Wizard of Oz, which is, I think, a direct allegory for it is magic, but there's just somebody behind the curtains pulling strings, flashing lights, and it's no magic.
Yeah, the mechanical Turk.
Yes.
What a fantastic image. Cool. I mean,
Yeah.
in terms of then of the things that you've seen that go wrong, there's obviously many of them, but I think the fundamental one that came out there was basically burning money without looking at the ROI or the long-term value in the organization when it comes to a transaction. And that was one of the things I wanted to get to, because clearly one of the things you do is go in and identify the points where there are gaps in the story, in the understanding, in the fundamentals of a business. So what are the kinds of things that you look at to turn an organization around from having loads of these gaps to filling some of them in, I guess?
So I'm going to start and bring it really to an M&A perspective, because that's where I've been shifting a lot of my focus, probably so over the last 10 years. Whilst I've been doing a lot of transformations, the majority of my work have, over the past 10 years, centered around M&A transactions, be it something that is in transaction, or a company has, or a fund has acquired something and they neglected to invest in it. So, or they've made multiple acquisitions and didn't integrate them, or there's an imminent transaction looming and we need to now look at this target, do due diligence on them, and then make sure that we can integrate it. And what I look at is usually how the technology correlates to the commercial, the financials that the company presents, what the operations look like, the people structure, and does the technology, and technology, I put a very big umbrella of technology. And in that, I include enterprise management systems, connectivity and infrastructure, cybersecurity, data, digital intellectual property, content. You'd be surprised how many times people do not think about content as an asset. Yeah, it happens often. Licensing and any agreements, third-party services. So it becomes, and AI sits in the mix of those with automation and data. And there's a big part that what they only focus on is, in most transactions, the product technology. Is the code sound? Is it secure? But they're not necessarily considering the wider spectrum of how does the business operate. So there's code reviews on the core product, but that even gets neglected because it doesn't necessarily always consider the wider remit of the data and the licensing. And I've encountered that in a transaction last year where third-party data services that was a key component, never mind an enabler, of 3 of the products wasn't licensed for commercial use.
Oh, wow.
So there's things like that that doesn't seem obvious, and a lot of it gets hidden in financials. So you see the top line, everything seems to be working fine. But the moment it needs to transition into a new state, either being integrated into a new company or it's investment, and the investors will expect change to really drive efficiencies and new products for additional revenue, that things just don't work. So when I look at due diligence on a company, and I do it for pre-transaction as well for some sell-side companies,
right,
helping them be in a good state.
Ready.
Exactly. Be ready so that they don't come under additional scrutiny through due diligence, but potentially even remediate and create value before the transaction. And I've done so in one example where there was a carve-out, and whilst helping them through being carve-out ready, discovered that they were actually paying a third party or third parties for data services, where the company that was selling this division actually owned the assets that the data was derived from. So they were paying third-party providers over £1 million a year for data that they already owned themselves.
Wow. Okay. So just to bring the terminology into perspective, for some of those people not familiar with M&A transactions, a carve-out is when an organization sells a department or a part of itself.
Or a division or subsidiary to either private equity or
to its own
another company. Yes.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is, in that situation, that the division or whatever it was being sold were licensing from a third party data that was owned by the parent company, effectively.
Not even by the parent company.
By itself.
By itself.
Wow. Okay.
And it was assets that was hidden in the finances as assets, but they did not translate that through to the product and the data. All they could see was the line items in the GL, and I stepped into that and I did proper auditing. And because I've picked up, what are these third-party data services you use? Can you show me the catalog and agreements? And they're like, oh, no, we don't have all of that. It's just, that's the data which we use. And I went back and traced through, where does that data come from? Only to discover that, wait, there's one name here of one of these service providers. And luckily they had some agreement, and it showed they get this data from X service. And I said, but X service, isn't that yours? And they're like, oh yeah, we own that. And that's then when I went into, let's dig in and actually understand what you've got.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you just said it yourself when you audit, because when you're going through, I was thinking, well, this sounds very much like the financial due diligence you do on, assets and liabilities.
Yes.
You're effectively doing the same thing on the digital and data assets and liabilities then of the organization. Yeah. And
interestingly, along with that, like I said, I really focus everything onto operations. And in technology, doing technology, data, AI due diligence, it needs to relate back to, how does the company operate? Is it compliant? What are the risks? What does it support the commercial and financial due diligence that's done? So it can't just be done in isolation. It needs to fit in. And often the data, looking at the data and the processes, that gives an indication of how accurate the financials actually are. Because financials is usually reported at the high level and does not necessarily go down into the detailed transaction level. And we have that problem at the moment, even more so, with ARR being reported in a lot of cases, which is unrealized revenue. It is booked revenue, but it's not realized revenue. And some of the due diligence that I'm doing look at, in the sales systems, do they actually have that? Is there a clear order? Is that order already fulfilled? Because you can't book the revenue until you fulfill it.
Yep.
And so you have a disconnect between the reality in operations and what the data tells you there versus what's reported in finances.
Right, because the finances is sometimes as much forecast as it is reality.
Not necessarily forecast, it is reported in ways that's favorable.
Yeah,
it's probably the better way to put it.
Okay, fair enough. So comparing the two between the actual digital assets and data assets compared to the financial assets and liabilities as well, key part of finding discrepancies and figuring out
finding discrepancies. It's not the objective, but it sometimes flags discrepancies.
Okay, cool. So then once you've got that audit of where it is, and I guess you can then start making decisions on what next from there. So from an M&A and driving value bit,
I wouldn't stop it there.
Okay.
And when you say driving value from it, my approach is, you're doing due diligence not just to go through a tick box exercise of we've looked at it, is it red, amber, green, but to quantify that risk. If it's a red, what is the size? How big is the impact? And what do you need to do to remediate it? Or how's it going to materialize and need to be addressed post-transaction? So it's not about just this point in time to discount any valuations, but it's to inform how you're going to operate in the future, how you're going to transition the business. So due diligence isn't just a tick box scrutiny. It is a tool and a process to help accelerate and clean up what it needs to look like into the future. So it's planning, it's clear estimation so that you can budget for integration. You can define TSAs and know where the friction's going to be, know where the impacts on the business is going to be, because you're now going to change systems. You need to extract data out. That takes effort. You might need to harness a lot of information in people's heads that won't be there. Some people might stay behind. And that's a lot of times in a carve-out, a big constraint, because all the people don't necessarily go along with the business. You might have product specialists. And again, have seen that where talk about the titles, the CTO looked at, or the CTO of the sell side also had responsibility for the subsidiary, and therefore they did not have their own specialists inside the business to own the product thereafter. So you start to get a sense of where there's going to be gaps going forward and how that needs to be addressed.
And I think that's one of the things that's showing up, the sheer amount of work you've done in this space, because it's something I've seen I've been involved in 3-4 transactions so far. And I think one of the things that became clear to me by transaction number 2 was, well, what happens after the papers are signed? The transition, as you called it, which can in some cases be integration, in other cases it can be standing the business up on its own 2 legs, and in other cases it can be joining it into a portfolio of other companies in an organization or a group. And thinking through what actually happens at that stage, I think is something that quite a lot of the times people sort of look at this great big event of the transaction itself happening, and beyond that is kind of the future. Yeah, exactly. But what you're saying here is very much planning for that and turning that into an integrated part of the planning is a key way of building and generating long-term value in the transaction itself.
It accelerates. How the way I view it is preserve value, so making sure that you have stable state, because that helps you then accelerate creating value into the future. Because otherwise, you will work to each event individually and then try and rethink. This approach helps you run a journey rather than to sprint. Maybe the tortoise and the hare is a good example. When I get on my bicycle, I might not necessarily follow that principle so clearly, but it is not necessarily going slowly, but doing things in a sensible manner. And that has a far longer lasting, more sustainable way of creating value rather than it being little pockets of activity. And it is very much a continuum. That you said you've been on several transactions. It's celebrated at the close of the deal. And I've been brought in on several occasions by private equity funds where they've built up a portfolio, and 2 years after their last acquisition, they realize, oh, we haven't integrated them. So we've got massive duplication on licenses, conflicting processes, not even duplicate processes, where they've got portfolio companies competing with each other instead of actually creating composite product sets and doing upsell and cross-sell. So there's a lot of that. Oh, the transaction event, great. And then forgetting that the success of a transaction, be it a carve-out or an acquisition or a merger, is actually post-transaction. And then having all those assumptions that things will just be fine. That, I think, is one of the bigger problems, is assuming there's a lot of assumptions, and it's not assumptions shared, and it's not assumptions that are being addressed. And therefore, you get a lot of things not happening. I said a lot, but that is the case. People operate in their own pockets, and one of the things that I bring in, and I think every CTO, CIO should do, because the technology spans the entire organization, is bring those various leads across the business, from marketing, finance, operations, product, bring them all together and have a sense of how they really align from a systems to data, security. All of that comes together, and why I think technology is becoming so much more important, both in deals and in transformation, because it is a unifying part.
Yeah, it's a central part of most businesses now. It underlies almost every department and piece of it. But the bit that I took away from that was, number one, preserving the value into the future, which is something I think is something you need to be slightly longer sighted about the transaction itself. Yeah. And number two is planning for success of the transaction thesis, because I think as long as it's a thesis and stays on paper, it's theoretical value.
Yep.
Whereas if you actually make a plan for that, and as you said, bringing all the leads together into the same space to talk about that plan, that integration is actually key, because without that, you end up with mismatched assumptions all over the place.
Indeed, yes. Look, investment thesis, there's a thing about investment thesis, and when we see a lot of pure strategy advisory, is it usually looks good on paper. The PowerPoints are magnificent. The investments it's really eye-watering, but it's grandiose. It looks fantastical, but it's not grounded in reality. And in most cases, it does not consider, even if there's recommendations made for various wonderful things, they don't necessarily consider each other and how they need to fit together. So
even in one of those decks, you could have conflicting pieces of action that are supposed to happen.
Not necessarily obviously conflicting,
right?
But they will compromise each other, either through trade-offs or having significant dependencies on each other, being perfect rather than it really focus on how does it look like in a real business environment. Can they do this? Do they have the foundations to do what's needed? Are they even willing to do so? And will it have the real return? And a good example I've had was a strategy consultancy presented a private equity client of mine. I was brought in as interim CIO, CTO again. And the one thing that stood out was they made a recommendation for AI-based, hyper-personalized dynamic pricing for a hospitality operator.
Right.
And to implement that, the estimate was around £5 million from the strategy consultancy, but no real measure of what it will return. When we looked at it, and they just said, you absolutely have to do it. I mean, you're a hospitality operator, you need to do hyper-personalized pricing and dynamic pricing. And part of it was unpicking all these recommendations. And when we got into the details, I found that it'll only return £200,000 additional revenue per year. That is not a good return.
It's not worth investing £5 million in, is it?
No. And what I did instead was look at the data that they had and the systems they had and looked at the customer lifetime value, where the customers drop off. Where do they have either no return customers, where the friction points are, and discover that the processes was they focused on selling the booking, the initial booking. And it was always just back to that single transaction, not how you manage the customer through a life cycle.
So there's sort of an opportunity in upsell and cross-sell then?
Never mind upsell and cross-sell, to provide a better fulfillment of services. So
okay, right.
When they're on holiday, give them discounts. Whilst they're on holiday, why not give them a discount to rebook immediately? Instead of starting to market to them, oh yes, Johnny goes on holiday. Last year he books for a week or 2 weeks in July. So in March, April, we'll send them some emails and hopefully they'll rebook. Here's some promotions. So a simple shift to just giving them promotions. Why not rebook for next year at this discounted price? I mean, you already then start to consume your capacity before you even entering the new year. £50,000 off investment just to get slight adjustments around the CRM. No fanciful things. £500,000 bookings within 3 months, additional bookings. And that was purely managing the customer life cycle rather than to just focus on a single booking transaction.
Excellent. So it wasn't quite inverting the number, but it was certainly the other way around in terms of profit versus loss. Good. So one of the things I wanted to sort of infer from that then is that you will understand the differences between the paper version, the thesis, and what can actually be done if you're actually in the business, if you understand the business, the processes, the operations, which is really good news for a lot of our listeners who are in these kinds of businesses, who are either potentially looking at a transaction or not even thinking there will be a transaction coming up, but don't really realize that they need to be ready for one or should be ready for one at any point. So are we able to then, Jaco, to sort of distill down the key steps that you take for any CTO, CIO, CDO, CAIO in any organization right now, whatever the title is that they have, in terms of being ready for the deal, whether they know it's coming or not?
So let's park the deal, because this is something that needs to be done throughout. I think the first part is understand the operations and equate all technology, data, and under technology, I lump in AI, all automations. How the business operates, have that just catalog. It doesn't need to be grandiose and perfectly detailed, but know what you're dealing with now, because there's already expectations on doing things better in the moment. There's likely projects in play. There's possibly some transformation activity. The CEO has his sights on a new vertical to enter. And without knowing what you're dealing with, you're probably not going to be able to respond to any requests. We see that a lot with how it goes back to stability of the organization. If you want to scale and you've got crumbling systems, huge burden on manual work, then you can't drive that growth.
You don't have a good foundation to jump from.
Yes, you don't have a platform to jump from. Or if you're going to jump and you press down, it's going to crumble below you.
And so we're not talking about sort of in-depth audit here, are we? We're just talking
No.
about a fairly straightforward document that just lays out operations and the processes that happen in the organization.
This is what we do. This is the processes. Here's the technology that's involved. Here's the data. This is how it flows. And if I change this, just having some awareness, and I put in the agreements with third parties and licensing. So if I change this, if I'm all of a sudden adding a new product and I'm scaling my storage and my processing, what impact it's going to have. So you've got awareness of your current state, at least. And then it is starting to interrogate and asking the questions from the business. Where do you want to go?
Cool. So is that step 2 then? So figuring out the actual direction of where you're trying to go in the business.
And that is very much working with the business. It's not always direction, but having a clear path of, there might be a clear future or an exit. They might be leading up to a transaction, but it's knowing what's being planned so that you can slot things in at the right time. Be strategic, that you can be strategic about technology rather than this is happening, now do a transformation.
Yeah,
or
reactive.
This is happening, oh, we've got an incident, now remediate something. It is about, it's a sustainable, lower level of investment rather than a reactive big investment and change that you're going to encounter. So it's know what you've got, do it proactively, being prepared and actioning in smaller increments rather than big, grandiose transformations, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
And then, importantly, ensuring the business change. So don't just do it on a technology basis. Everything has a side-by-side business change. You introduce a new system or even make a configuration, a new process, change new data, make sure the business fits and that you've got continuity there.
So this is changing the operations, changing the processes, changing the people who do it so that you have the right things in the right place. Yep. Okay,
Yes.
so step 3, make sure you preserve, that's part of the preserving value, isn't it? To make
That's
sure you maintain the
value.
operational. Yep.
Correct.
Excellent. Okay, and then so that's 3 steps. And then where would you go from there as a sort of?
I think the last part is looking at specific events, big events. There's a transaction happening. So that in itself, if it's a carve-out, it's going to have dramatic change. But you know what you're dealing with, hopefully. Therefore, you are prepared for due diligence.
Yep.
And you've already started to plan for how do you execute. You might have even, if it was part of a group and your subsidiary, you may already have proactively started to separate your data, knowing your processes, how and where there's dependencies, so that TSAX, any transition services agreements, are easier to define and easier to manage post-transaction. So it's looking at how you then deal with this dramatic change event, and an M&A transaction, be it being acquired or carved out and mergers, are very disruptive events. And it places a huge burden on the executive. And what's often neglected is actually considering how much impact it has on people in a normal operational environments. They are usually very unaware and consciously usually being kept unaware of a transaction happening, only for once it's announced and said, okay, now this all changes. And people go, oh, what now? And they will be faced with new systems, new ways of working. And it's taking everybody along and helping them through that process. That's, I think, a very important part, is not just neglecting everybody and just focusing on the exec and that they've made a success.
Yeah. That's one of the things I often say about coaching overall is as leadership, we should be looking at people, process, and technology in that order pretty much.
Yes.
And I think the same thing goes with preparing for and executing through a transaction as well. Bring the people along first, get them to sort out the processes, and ultimately that determines what technology is correct or necessary to run with.
Yeah. Again,
glad that fits so
technology
neatly.
last, right?
Yes. Excellent. Cool. Well, there's 4 really distinct steps then. I mean, one of the things I also love to ask in here is if you were to give one piece of advice to a technology leader, CTO, CIO, it doesn't really matter what the title is, but an executive in engineering or technology, and they've not really been thinking that much about a transaction on the horizon or anything else, what tips or advice would you give to them?
Well, in my experience, companies are 95% of activity, new product development, somebody is spurring it from a transaction glimmer in there. They've got a little glimmer somewhere that there will be a transaction. So they're creating new products. It's about value creation. So having in mind, always asking, not just doing what you're being asked for, but understanding why that needs to be done. Because there's usually a far greater strategic financial driver behind it. And it's 95% of the time, either there was transactions that happened before, we need to build new products because we want to sell in a year or two's time, or we need to invest and modernize, drive efficiencies because we need to improve EBITDA because we want to sell in a few years' time. So it's have that in mind, even in large corporates where it seems like it's fairly stable. There's M&A activity all the time, and entering a new market is as dramatic as an M&A transaction. So always knowing what is actually driving, why I'm being tasked to do this.
Yeah, understanding the incentive of where you're actually going. Because I think that's a very important point. I think there's a lot of non-founder, non-business owner leaders who don't really think beyond the goals, the KPIs, the objectives, whatever they might be, the OKRs that they've been set to, well, why do those exist? Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right that in a lot of situations, it is either a transaction or it's a significant money or investment value generating decision that will come as the ultimate driver behind those things. And as you say, it's often kept fairly close in terms of the circle that it's around. But for those people who have been around a bit longer, we can kind of see beneath the surface a bit and figure out where it's coming from. But for those people who haven't considered it, I think it's a very important point. Have a look at what that transaction likely is and drive from there.
Or the event's likely is. I wanted to add one more thing in there, and that is around not just looking at the next quarter or this transaction. And you mentioned KPIs, and that's what triggered the thought is a lot of executive and normal people measurement is done on a quarterly, half-yearly, yearly basis. So the incentive that people have are just to focus on the immediate and not the strategic. And therefore, we'll have responses to tactical. Just, I saw that wonderful thing. I want that. That seems to be something that's going to make a change. Do it now. It's human nature. We see things and we respond to it. But it's in part driven by measurement, focusing on the immediate rather than the long-term value. And it goes back to preserve and then create value rather than to just reactive do things. And you're going to save a lot of wasted investment and effort and headaches if you focus more on the long term and then start to do things fitting into that roadmap rather than to be reactive to everything that comes in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think it's a lot of the time it's down to, I think about it as the way businesses accelerate. And I often refer back to Formula One cars on the grid. Because if you see an uncontrolled Formula One car accelerating, is out of control, you see it sort of fishtailing with the back of the car sliding all over the place, the front wheels being fought for control. And that's kind of analogous to that wasted effort, that wasted time.
Yeah, I was going to say, so F1 cars, do you ever see them speeding full speed into a corner? And there's some physics behind it. They slow down before the corner and they start accelerating in the apex. So they're not out of the corner yet. They accelerate as they hit the apex because physics actually push them out of the corner faster than they would have been if they were just going full speed.
Absolutely. I did a whole solo episode actually, which I called, upgrade the brakes, because it's one of the things I often talk about with AI. A lot of people look at AI as being this fast engine, whereas the things to upgrade first is the brakes, the checks, the test suites, the CI/CD, upgrade all that stuff first, and then be ready to accelerate when you get to the apex of the corner. So yes, upgrade the brakes.
I like that.
Is often one of the key things I often talk about. And indeed, there's a whole episode you can have a look at and listen to as well.
Will do.
Jaco, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you today.
Adam, same. Thank you.
Have a great day. And to all of our listeners, keep leading with impact. Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favor in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on the CTOplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.